You're listening to the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Lehmiller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. Humans evolved for face-to-face courtship in small, interconnected groups. Attraction unfolded gradually, choices were limited, and bonding happened in real time. Fast forward to today, and we're navigating global dating markets, algorithmic matchmaking, AI-powered recommendations, endless novelty, and instant and constant rejection. Technology is evolving at a breathtaking pace. The human brain is not. So what happens when ancient mating systems collide with modern systems? How are modern technologies like dating apps affecting the brain? And are they making it easier or harder to find love? And as AI becomes more sophisticated, could it eventually know our romantic preferences better than we know ourselves? More broadly, are we creating environments that our evolved attachment systems weren't designed to handle? Or are humans far more adaptable than we think? Today, we're continuing our conversation with Dr. Justin Garcia, an evolutionary biologist and executive director of the Kinsey Institute at Indiana University. He is the chief scientific advisor for Match and author of the new book, The Intimate Animal, The Science of Sex, Fidelity, and Why We Live and Die for Love. This is going to be another fascinating conversation that you won't want to miss. If you're looking to gain a broad understanding of human sexuality or refresh your knowledge, check out the next Human Sexuality Intensive at the Kinsey Institute. Participants will explore foundational concepts and recent developments across a range of topics related to human sexuality through an interdisciplinary, evidence-based lens. Topics will include sex, gender and sexuality, identity and intersectionality, sexual behavior and consent, dating and relationships, and more. This course is open to both emerging and established professionals looking to specialize their knowledge, as well as those seeking new career directions. Previous participants have come from all over the world, and those who successfully complete the program will receive a course certificate from the Kinsey Institute. The next intensives will be in May and June of this year. To learn more, visit kinseyinstitute.org or check the link in the show notes. Hi, Justin, and welcome back to the show.
Hi, Justin. Always great to be with you.
Okay, so in the last episode, we talked all about how evolution shapes love and desire. So let's talk about what this means for our modern world. You know, our brains evolved when we were living in these small face-to-face groups thousands of years ago. So what happens when you take the same mating psychology and you drop it into this global app-based marketplace? You know, is that a recipe for disaster? Are we even equipped for this? What do you think?
Yeah, it's such a big question, and it's one that so many people are struggling with. In the United States alone, there's well over 100 million single adults, people moving in and out of romantic and sexual relationships. So this isn't a small issue, really, of how do we engage in courtship and mating today. I think it's both, and I think that's the challenge. I think it's both. There's a lot of positives of our new technologies, and there's a lot of challenges. There's an evolutionary mismatch. And that's the complicating fact. I think there's so many hot takes we all hear about how the apps or the websites are really bad or, you know, what's going on with dating culture. And I think that when we understand the science a little bit more and what we evolved to do in courtship, we can kind of tease that apart. So we'll do some of that together. As we think about, as you said, and when we think about how we evolved to find partners and keep partners, one of the challenges today is that there's so much data, there's so much information, there are so many options. On the one hand, we can pick up a phone and you can find someone with the same hobby, the same religious background, the same kink, the same allergy, whatever it is that you are looking for. There is opportunity that our ancestors never had to find someone that aligns. That's especially true for LGBTQ population. So we see actually somewhat higher rates of online dating and app dating in gay men and lesbian women in particular. And I think sometimes we can take for granted if we're in a major city, if you're in New York or LA or Miami, that's not an issue. But in a lot of the country and in a lot of the world, the apps feel a lot safer to people in terms of, would you just go walk into any bar and meet someone? And there's a lot, I think, about the apps that are helpful. But we also know that we hear over and over these stories of people feel overwhelmed. And I also want to note, we just did a study, I just wrote about this in an op-ed, that when we look overall and we ask people their attitudes about app dating, that they can skew negative. But if you separate people who have actually used the apps and not used the apps, the people who have used them have more positive attitudes about them than those that haven't. So a lot of the reports of people have negative attitudes about apps, you're including folks who have never used them.
Yeah.
And so there's this sense that they're a problem, but not actually among the users. And the other thing than the users, we did one study in 5 nations, and we found that particularly women reported that in many cases they felt the apps were safer and gave them more control. So we looked at several different countries, but women in our study in India and Turkey in particular, where the gender egalitarian patterns are different, they felt that apps gave them more control in first dating and that they had more safety from first getting to know someone on an app. So there are a lot of caveats. I'm always really cautious when there's this hot take that there's such trouble, that I think that's really missing some of the other bigger opportunities about them and where people are benefiting and enjoying them. That said, we also know there's problems. We know there's problems with sexual harassment. We've published on that, on unsolicited nude photos, on dick pics that get sent on them. We know that that's an issue, and some of the apps have been trying to address it, and some haven't, frankly. We also know that there's a lot of concern around catfishing and how do you really know who the person is. That's a great example. Our ancestors didn't worry about catfishing because you were dating someone that you knew who they were. You often knew who their family network was. There was a social accountability. With apps, we're meeting people who are genuinely strangers often that, in fact, part of the reason you download them is because you haven't found someone in your friend network, so you're looking to strangers. There isn't that social accountability piece to all of it. So given that landscape, everything I just said, the 2 pieces that I think I'd like to talk about. One is we evolved with a tendency in courtship to know someone. You knew their actual social network. I don't mean online social network. You knew their family, their community, typically, not always. But you also had a sense of, you invoke the bodily senses, I should say, in courtship. So you could hear their voice. You could see their body language. You could smell them. You could feel them. You could taste them in some cases. We know that we have evolved mechanisms that use those bodily senses to determine our attraction to partners. In the digital space, we're removed from a lot of that. Now, we see that people try to find information. Like they'll say, do you have a picture of you smiling? Because I want to look at your teeth. They try to get a sense of hygiene. They try to get a sense of health. We try and pick things out of that, and there have been all these studies that do that, but it's not the same. It's not the same of these mechanisms that we have that we're not flexing and that we want to flex. So I think that's one challenge. Even though there's all this opportunity, it's just a mismatch from the way that our species evolved to engage in courtship. There's that piece. And then the other is the sheer amount of information. And we know that people have a hard time when there's so many options. They have a hard time investing in partners because you see someone on an app, you go, well, they're interesting. There's things I'm attracted to, but they haven't hit my whole list. And let me just keep swiping. I'll find someone else who hits my list. Our ancestors, if you were in smaller groups, you didn't have a sense of an unlimited resource. And many of us, even though we could talk about dating being hard, we have a sense that there's this unlimited resource which you can just keep swiping. We can find more. So what that means is we don't really get to know people that we could have good relationships with or pleasurable relationships with because we have a sense that there's someone else who's going to hit more items on our list. And the reality is, in our studies, in our Singles in America study with Amanda Gesselman and I, and we found that pretty high numbers, about 70% of people have become attracted to someone they weren't initially attracted to. Over a third have fallen in love with someone they weren't initially attracted to. So that's a reminder that that instantaneous profile, that if you really want to build a relationship with someone, there's a step 2, step 3, step 4, but we're making these rather quick judgments. And we're romanticizing those quick judgments. We found in our data around 60% of single Americans believe in love at first sight. There's a part of me that thinks that's so romantic and cute, but then there's a part of me, you know where I'm going.
I think it's bullshit.
Yeah, it's troubling, right? It's also, we're walking around with this idea that like, I'll know right away. 6 out of 10 of us, so single Americans at least, are walking around thinking that they can know instantly. And it's like, actually, the research would tell us that you probably can't. I mean, you can get a gut check if someone feels really like unhygienic or dangerous, but so much of connection takes time to get to know. So that's, I think, the challenge with these technologies. Great opportunity, but also preventing us from honing in and building the relationships that we know take time.
I appreciate everything you just said, but I think there is another challenge of online dating that is important to highlight, which is the gender asymmetry that exists in terms of outcomes. And historically, men have been the initiators of sexual relationships, right? But even today, there still is that expectation that For example, men should be the ones who ask someone out on a date. We recently did a study on this with single Americans and find that, men and women today still believe men should be the initiators. And so when you go onto this online dating context, right, suddenly a guy who's trying to initiate is competing with the whole other world for this other woman's attention if we're talking about things in a heterosexual context. And so that creates this situation where women are getting tons and tons of requests and matches, and men are getting far fewer of them. And so the outcomes aren't really quite the same. And I think it leads to a state of affairs where a lot of men find online dating really frustrating because they're not getting any matches. And a lot of women find it frustrating for a different reason because they're just getting too many matches. And it's like, and then there's the decision overload. And then that leads to differences in how they're thinking about and evaluating a potential match that they get, right? Where men tend to swipe right haphazardly because they want to get a match, let alone many. Whereas for women, with so many matches, you got to find a way to whittle it down. And so then you sometimes start relying on those heuristics that might lead you to pursue a relationship with someone who maybe wasn't the optimal match because you excluded somebody who might have been better.
Yeah, it's such a good reminder of what are people really experiencing. And there is an overwhelm of I think for both men and women, there's an overwhelm of you're sending so many messages. Typically in heterosexual context, men, you're sending so many messages, no one's responding. And women, how do you sort through the noise? And part of that also can encourage the bad behavior. So when we think of things like the unsolicited sexting, and well, if you send a picture of your penis to 20 people and one writes back and thinks it's funny or flirty, well, then you have a very low level of reinforcement for bad behavior, but then you're kind of doing it a lot. And maybe they did, not to judge. Maybe the person did find it funny and playful. And I'm not casting a moral net on that. But we know that from our data that most heterosexual women find it offensive and gross was the word used. And so that's absolutely right. And it also depends on where you are. So we know that sex ratios or gender ratios can impact all sorts of aspects of courtship, both in real time and on the apps. And depending on what city you're in and where is your sense of availability. So there's a lot going on with how we interact with these apps. So if you are a guy and you're on an app and you're sending messages and you know that you have to send so many for a reply, well, then you stop to invest as much in your messages. So then the issue becomes, well, then in heterosexual context, women are saying, I'm getting all these low investment messages from guys that just say, hey, or what's up? Well, the other side of that is because you really want to spend a half hour crafting a message that engages with each profile when you know most of them go unanswered. About 98 out of 100 of them go unanswered, which is partly why we're also seeing more people interested in matchmaking. Going to professional matchmakers is on the rise, and that can be quite expensive depending on who you go to and who you work with. I have a friend who's one matchmaker. It's $100,000 to be a client.
Wow.
I mean, you really have a huge range of what that landscape looks like. I'm drifting from your point on the app. Sorry, Justin. There's so much we can cover to talk about. But you're right. We understand more and more that there is this sense of dissatisfaction. But at the same time, the apps and the websites are still the most common way singles are meeting. So it's become this new arena for connecting. And part of it, as you were talking about it, I think what's so interesting is it's what biologists call a lek mating system. So we see this in birds sometimes. I remember being in Costa Rica one summer on a field project, actually, and you can see certain birds lek, and you'll get a bunch of males line up, and they all start hopping and dancing, and the female will land, and she'll check out who's hopping and dancing, and if she likes one, she hops next to him, and they fly off together. But sometimes she'll just leave. She'll be like, okay, good performance, boys, gotta go. We are not a lekking species, so we also are engaging in some funny way in a kind of mating behavior, a mating ritual that's very different from one that our ancestors that we evolved with. This idea. That's the funny thing about some of the dating shows, this idea that you have a platter of 25 available people and they're all really performing at the exact same moment for your attention. That is somewhat unusual for us. And it's the same issue of so much data, as it were, so many options that we struggle. And one experimental study that I love, if I'm remembering the numbers correctly, people were given 6 online dating profiles versus 24 online dating profiles. And the folks that only had 6 were happier with their decisions afterwards. They were more satisfied with their decisions than 24. And that was just in a laboratory experimental study. But the point being, when we have all of these options that we're trying to sort through, what happens is we get in this mindset of saying, well, maybe I should have picked that one, or maybe that's the one I should have engaged with. So there's a lot of cognitive tricks happening that amplify the problem that you brought up, that I think can make it feel so challenging and heavy. Yet at the same time, they're still the most common way singles are meeting, because where else are you connecting?
Yeah. But what you're saying, more isn't always better when it comes to getting matches on dating apps. We need to talk about low libido. If you've ever looked for a supplement with the goal of giving yours a boost, you know what a minefield it can be. There are so many options, and some of them contain really questionable ingredients. It's a market that's notorious for products that are underdosed, ineffective, or in some cases, just downright shady. That's why I'm excited to tell you about Drive Boost from VP Health. VP Health has changed the game by focusing on what truly matters: trust and transparency. Imagine a libido supplement formulated by doctors, one that's rigorously third-party tested for purity and potency, so you know exactly what you're getting. And it's made right here in the USA. That's Drive Boost. This supplement is also unique because it's formulated for men and women alike. So if you're ready to ditch the shady stuff and choose a libido supplement that you can feel confident about and that actually works, it's time to check out Drive Boost. Learn more and get yours at vb.health. Visit vb.health and use code Justin for 10% off, or click the link in the show notes. In the world of dating apps, we have this near infinite choice in terms of which profiles we can engage with, but we're also engaging in this constant social comparison to other people that we're seeing on the apps. And we also experience a lot of rejection and things like ghosting, where we start forming a connection with someone and then they just disappear and we never hear from them again. And that can feel really bad. But I think there's also another aspect of these dating apps that is important in terms of how they affect the brain, which is that it affects the dopamine system, right? I think this is part of what leads some people to have a problematic relationship with the app. And I've done an episode before where we talked about mindful dating and, you know, how you can use dating apps in a healthier way. But I think a lot of people get stuck in this sort of reward loop cycle where, you know, they'll have a notification that comes through from the app, and all the apps have their own unique ding, right? And so when you hear that, it triggers something in your brain. You get that anticipatory dopamine spike, and then you might get this feeling or sense of potential dread or potential hope, right? Because that notification could mean, hey, this could be the start of long-term love or a relationship. It could also mean I'm being rejected, or it's outright cruelty, or somebody's sending me an unsolicited pic that I don't want to see. And so, you know, it brings up all those complex emotions. And I think for anybody listening who's ever used a dating app, like when you hear that ding, like you get this visceral reaction, right? Because it's so loaded. There's so much meaning behind it.
Yeah, it could be love, it could be sex, it could be rejection. I love that you say that. And I particularly love that the thread for me in that is that the more we understand about the science of these, of how our brain works, how we interact with love and sex and mating behaviors and these technologies, then we can harness it. The more we understand that, then we think about, okay, I'm going to turn the notifications off. Oh, I'm going to have a time that I check it every day. Oh, I'm going to only send X number of messages. I'm only going to look at Y number of profiles. When we can understand those challenges and those cognitive mechanisms and those heuristics that we're engaging in, that we're making kind of quick decisions off of limited data, then we can own that and really try and make it better. And I think that's where I'm always optimistic. I'm optimistic about maybe too many things. And the other part of it is I'm also cautious about some of the critiques about what's going on with dating culture or the dating technologies. We see a lot of evidence that a lot of this is going on across domains. So the point about ghosting, we're seeing all this data in the business sciences about people ghosting with new jobs. So they're ghosting when they're applying for jobs, or they're new employees, and when they kind of don't feel it's right, they just don't show up to work one day and never formally resign. They don't give 2 weeks notice. So these are becoming, they're generalized social patterns. The same with burnout. We talk a lot about dating burnout that particularly young people are experiencing. We have some data that we showed that people have burnout across domains. They have burnout in their families and their careers and their economy and their finances, with their healthcare. Is it really unique to just dating context? It's such a big part of our life, love and sex and dating and finding a partner. But some of these patterns are we're seeing changes in social behavior and how we use technology. And I'm just cautious. I don't have a particular horse in the race about whether or not dating apps are good or bad, or matchmakers are better, or meeting in a bar is better. I'm just not fully convinced by some of the overly critical arguments that they are really pulling in all the data of what is happening to our social behavior today.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's very easy to shit on dating apps, right?
Yeah.
But the reality is different people are using them in different ways. Not all apps are created equal. There are lots of positive things that can come out of dating apps, lots of negative things too. But we need to figure out, better understand how they impact us so that we can figure out how to use them in healthier, more mindful ways.
Exactly. And I think we can fall into this nostalgia trap, that this idea that like, well, dating is suddenly hard with all these technologies. And I often think like, what do we think it was a century ago?
It was easier in the 1800s when, you had to engage in this courtship behavior and make these grand gestures.
Yeah. Or engage in conflict to the death, right? I mean, courtship is a competition, and it has always been a competition. And some species, including in humans, it can also often be quite dangerous and quite intense and emotionally painful and emotionally joyful. But at the end of the day, it is a competition, and it has always been one for our species.
Yeah. And I think it is very easy to romanticize the past and say, well, things were just easier back then when you didn't have all of the different choices and the feelings of overwhelm and so forth. But dating in the past brought its own set of complications. And I don't know that there was ever an ideal time to be in the dating market. Yeah. But given some of the specific challenges that exist around online dating today, we know that a lot of apps and companies are looking at potential solutions, and they're increasingly turning to AI as maybe the savior for, the future of online dating in terms of maybe helping people to find better matches and find matches more quickly. And so, I wanted to get your take on this. As AI becomes more sophisticated at analyzing things like our personality, our behavior patterns, even our communication style, could it potentially improve mate selection? Or do you think there are some aspects of our attraction to other people that just aren't predictable?
Yeah, it's funny. I just talked about being an optimist. Now you're going to see where I really think the world's on fire. And I'm actually quite cautious about how we're using AI in our dating life, in our intimate lives in general. There's some evidence that it can be really helpful for folks, and some of the companies are doing this. And for instance, in our Singles in America data, we found that about 26% of singles have used AI in some aspect of their dating life. Mostly that's help me pick the right picture, help me with the first message prompt, help my message, is it coherent, my profile information. Gen Z, it's much higher, about 50%, or I think it was 49% are using it, which makes sense. It's a kind of what we see with AI and across all sorts of domains, that the young, particularly Gen Z, are ushering in new habits of how we use it. I think that can be helpful. And I think of that in some ways like training wheels. It can be helpful to get us to, really feel more comfortable picking the right picture, activating your profile, whether it's whatever, if it's an app, it's a website, if it's a matchmaker platform, but also just thinking about connecting. Let's say you met someone and you're just sending text messages to connect with them. I think that can be helpful. The challenge for me is that and I think that's especially true for people who are neurodivergent. There's a lot of opportunity there to help engage in social interaction, dating, courtship interaction. The challenge for me is at some point you want to take the training wheels off. And I know I'm being a little cheeky when I say that, but I think helping people put their best foot forward is a great use of this tool. The challenge is that if we start using it to, one, be our main interface with someone else, or to replace, so with the rise of the sort of chatbot boyfriend, girlfriends, again, I think there's a place for them. If you have high psychological loneliness, we know that loneliness is so bad for your mental health and physical health. Okay, great. If this is helping you, I think that's a positive. What I worry about is that I don't think it's a replacement for human interaction. And there's quite a bit of evidence that technological interaction gets us a little bit. It's better than nothing, but not that it's the same as real human interaction. So, okay, you got nothing. This is great. But if you're using just a chatbot for your relationships instead of personal relationships, I worry about that. If we're using them endlessly to help put our best foot forward, I think that can be a challenge, because then are you ready to take the second step foot on your own without technology? And that can be a challenge. The other piece of it is about trust. So we know from data, I think Pew Research Center put some of this data out. Most Americans are pretty skeptical about AI and actually have a low degree of trust. Part of courtship is about trust. The number one thing we see that people want in a new partner is someone they can trust and confide in. Rates number one for both men and women across age groups, especially the last few years. Trust and confide in is at the top of the list. And attraction is in the top 5, I think top 10. Humor, intelligence, but trust and confide in. So if we know that so few people trust AI, and in a subsample of that Pew study, those that knew AI the most, they trusted it even less. So the more you know about it, the less you trust it. You could say that's not the same as interpersonal trust, and that's a fair argument to make. I did an open debate with Tao at the Arizona State University, and she made that point. She said, I'm not convinced that that's interpersonal trust. And fair enough. But I think this idea that you're using these technologies that we have relatively low trust in, and then it tells us, am I really getting an honest signal of the person I'm talking to? So part of early courtship, we talk about vulnerability and getting to know someone. The whole idea of vulnerability is that you're giving someone enough information to let them in, but that they can also, it's so much information they can harm you that it's a trust compact. If you're using technologies we don't trust, I think that undermines it. And if I think that all of our messages or your AI is really sending everything to me, then I feel like it's been a dishonest interaction.
Yeah.
That ruins courtship from the start. You're off on the wrong foot. So I think that these technologies are getting more popular, but we really have to be cautious about how we use them because we can undermine the mechanisms for connecting that our species has.
There are undoubtedly some cases where people are using an AI bot to figure out what to say to someone else. And so they're not being their authentic self. They're not really engaging in self-disclosure. And then the person on the other side is using an AI bot too to figure out what to say back. And so we just have these AIs in some cases that are communicating. And it's like, how are we even connecting at that point when we're outsourcing all of this to a piece of technology?
Yeah. And to your question, I didn't answer your other question. The other part of that is exactly how are we really connecting? How are using our evolved mechanisms for human social behavior, the need to belong and feel connected to others, both in social groups and in individual dyads. There's this piece of connecting. There's this piece of trust. There's this piece of, is this really an honest engagement? And I think that can really undermine then the building blocks that we initially have for a relationship. And then as you're trying to get to know someone more, but you feel like you were lied to, or you feel like there was a dishonest interaction, you've kind of cut a relationship off at the knees. And that can become a real problem for connection.
Yeah. You know, we're living in very interesting times, not just with AI and dating apps, but just in terms of our relationships, they've really fundamentally changed a lot. And for example, people are having less sex than they used to. We know that people are partnering and marrying much later in life than they used to. They're having fewer children. They're experimenting with new and different relationship structures. And so do you see this as a sign that humans are just very flexible and adaptive in terms of, you know, how we navigate our environment? Like, how do we situate, you know, these evolved mating systems in the context of what's happening today with so many changes afoot in terms of our sexual and romantic lives?
Yeah. On the one hand, when we look at the anthropological evidence, we know that there is a lot of diversity of people's sexual lives. That is understood often as adaptively responding to different ecologies, different environments. So for me, the age of the internet is in some ways a new ecology for us. And I think we're adapting in some ways and we're really struggling in other ways. What I see, and when I look at the data, is that there is this pattern of this desire for long-term bonding, this long-term romantic bonds, and this desire for sexual activity and how we try and reconcile them. And most places that we have looked, most places that researchers have examined, we see this tendency for social monogamy and then trying to pull in sexual monogamy into that. And there's cases of infidelity, there's cases of variation, there's all sorts of different structures, but that is the most common pattern that anthropologists have observed. Even in societies that allow different structures, some reports suggest that about 85% still partner monogamously. Again, that's the social relationship, isn't necessarily telling us something about the sexual life. But when we think of this modern moment, what's going on with, let's say, the so-called sex recession, as you brought up, even there, I think we have to be cautious. And as we know, there's so much about the sex recession that's still kind of inside baseball for sexologists that we're trying to figure out what's really going on. As an example, yes, okay, frequency of sexual behavior is down in a bunch of different data sets that researchers are seeing, but there's some caveats there. The actual frequency hasn't decreased for all subsets within those. So the number of people not engaging in sex has increased. There's more zeros that weigh down the average. But what does that mean for actual overall frequency for singles? Does it mean for people in relationships? And then the other question for me is it's an interesting behavioral question that's not telling us much about quality and satisfaction. So if we see people in relationships, let's say on an average, are having 6 less sexual events in a year, is it meaningful for their relationship? Is it impacting reproductive patterns? Is it impacting relationship satisfaction? Is it impacting relationship quality? Those are different questions. And it's not to say that the behavior one is not important. I think it's really interesting. It's just there's a lot of other elements that we still have to tease apart. And what about dating? Are we seeing a dating recession? Or there's a lot of pieces of that pie that we don't understand yet. And I worry that there's been so much attention just on this behavioral piece that there's a lot more work for you and I and our colleagues to still do to uncover what's going on.
Yeah, I was just going to say, we're never going to be out of a job because things are always changing in this world of sex and relationships. And it's a fascinating future we have ahead.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for this amazing conversation, Justin. It was a pleasure to have you here. Can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and your work and get a copy of your book?
Sure. Thanks, Justin. Always good to be with you. And thanks, everyone who joined us. So my new book, The Intimate Animal, is available anywhere you can buy a book. And you can find me on social media at Dr. Justin Garcia. You can also follow the Kinsey Institute. We share a lot of our research from across our different researchers, including Dr. Lehmiller. Thank you for tuning in. And I'd love to hear what you think about the book. So feel free to send me a note or connect on social.
Well, thank you again so much for your time. I really appreciate having you here. Also, thank you to my listeners. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. You can also follow me on the socials for daily sex research updates. I'm on X and Blue Sky at Justin Lehmiller, and I'm on Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.